Welcome back to Unfiltered Unspoken Podcast. And we love to see the smile on our guests. I see Brenda's over there smiling because we try to make the intros very personal.
Very cool.
Welcome, Brenda. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Welcome to Unfiltered Unspoken Podcast. Thank you for being a guest and expanding our platform. We truly appreciate it. And for those out there that don't know, we share life experiences of others in hopes that someone will connect to start their journey to healing or to see where they are at to help them realize what they are going through. We have our special guest, Brenda. She is the layoff lady. Brenda, can you come up and introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about yourself? And then, as y'all know, City Sid is going to kick off that first question.
Very cool. So, hi, everybody. My name is Brenda Peterson, and I blog and write under the name The Layoff Lady. Basically, over the course of my career, I've been laid off 7 times. And so, having friends and family who have found themselves in the position of being laid off, I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say, hey, I don't even know what to do. And so I've had so many conversations over the years just helping people figure out, like, what do you do after you get laid off and how do you kind of begin again? So I took all that knowledge that I had and I put that into a book that's called 7 Lessons for 7 Layoffs, a guide. And that's something that I share with people as I talk about things like layoffs and career resilience, and just making a plan going forward for your life and what you want your life and your work life to be life. So yeah, so I'm excited to be here to talk a little bit with you all about what that was like and how that could help other people.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here today with us again. So we'll start this a little differently just because we're dealing with a specified kind of trauma here. But I do want to ask, prior to, maybe you entering the workforce or you living at home, even with family, were layoffs something that you saw family deal with? Did parents ever go through it, or did you kind of see the fallout of it prior to it happening to yourself?
I really didn't. I grew up in a small town on a farm in rural Wisconsin, so it was a very different upbringing and a very different life. I remember when. After my dad died when I was 16, I remember my mom got a job in town. And that was like, oh, that's like working. She works for a company. And that was even a very different experience. So it's been interesting as I've gone through my career. And the first time that I was laid off, I didn't even realize that was like possible. It just wasn't anything that was on my radar. And so it was definitely a weird experience to go through. The first time I went through that, I was 29. And I just started a new job 4 months before, and it was right after 9/11. So along with a lot of people, I found myself in career transition. And being somebody who works in learning and development and has worked at startup companies and a lot of small companies, it's just an experience that I've ended up going through several times. So I've learned as I've gone. I've connected with other people who have gone through that too, and just figured out how to navigate that. And as I've learned, I've saved those lessons and tried to share those with other people who it would help.
And before I ask my question, I want to make sure I'm asking the correct question. Um, did you go through before the layoffs? Did you go through work trauma or any work abuse before your layoffs?
It kind of depended on the environment. I would say in one case I did. Um, and it it's always kind of interesting, working in companies. Every company has their own personality. I've worked for a lot of startups, which are a little bit scrappier, and people may have all sorts of different skill sets. So you don't know exactly who brings what to the table. Uh, there was at least one time where I was laid off, and I thought before that, I maybe should have taken some legal action on that, but I didn't, just because of the place I was at in life, and I was just trying to get through my own things. So it's a lot of times when I've been laid off, maybe a precursor or a sign was that there was something happening in the economy. I think of people who got laid off after COVID. I got laid off late COVID. I got laid off once due to basically when mortgage rates changed, and I worked for a company that dealt with mortgages. a couple times just companies who had various financial issues. So I think it's always stressful when companies are going through changes, because even if you haven't been laid off, you start thinking, well, am I going to be next? I know in one case I was in what I think was about the 7th round of layoffs, but it was hard to know because the company wasn't communicating really well. So, you'd think you had a meeting with somebody and you're like, oh, well, I guess they're gone now because there's a white dot on Microsoft Teams, which meant, oh, they don't work here anymore. So there's a little bit of trauma with dealing with that unknown. And I would say that even if you're left after a layoff, then you feel bad because you're left and you feel bad for all the people who were laid off. Uh, and when you get laid off, you're hip deep in your own trauma right then, figuring out, well, now what do I do? And I mean, I've been to this circus 7 times now, and I mean, it's never fun. It's always hard. It's always There's so much business stuff you have to do right away. You have to deal with all the doubt of like, okay, I think I'm good at what I do, but I keep on getting laid off. What's going on here? Maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. And then of course you always have that frustration of, oh, well, that guy got to keep his job and I've been doing his work forever, and you think, well, how do I keep getting picked? And then you start thinking, well, what am I doing? What am I doing that's maybe ending me up in this situation? So, I mean, there's no good side of a layoff to be on, because whether you're the person laying somebody off, uh, or you're the person who gets laid off, or somewhere in between, there's always just a lot going on, and it's just emotionally charged, and it's kind of ugly all the way around.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your first layoff, and kind of the fallout from that, being as though, you think you're all good. You just started 4 months ago. What was kind of the situation around that layoff?
So in that case, it was interesting because the job I had right before the job where I ended up getting laid off for the first time was with what we would now call a startup. It was kind of a small, scrappy tech company, and at that company, my paycheck bounced, and I went, "Whoa!" If ever there was a sign that said I need to switch jobs, I think it's your paycheck bouncing. So I realized I needed to get out of that place, and I went from this scrappier kind of startup company to this bigger, more established, safe, I thought, company that had more of a corporate structure and that was a little bit more corporate and a little bit more organized. And so I went to that job. And I realized shortly after I started, I don't know if this is the right place for me. And I was starting to think, maybe I need to reconsider. Maybe this was a misstep. Maybe I need to do something else. And then 9/11 happened. So that was September 11th. I got laid off in October. And my impression was that the people who got laid off were the people who either didn't hit the bottom line, which I was a new position. They weren't quite sure what they were trying to do with me. I wasn't making an impact yet. So I was one of the ones who got let go. And other folks who got let go were people who had maybe that should have happened to them a long time before, but they were still there. So it was a very strange experience. I do not remember much about that day. I remember I went to work, and then I remember being home again. And I know that I had a meeting with somebody who said, "Hey, you don't have this job anymore, and here's your letter, and here's what you have to do." But I don't remember a ton of that, just because it was so like, what are we even doing? And I remember that at that time in life, just bought a house. And so I went home and I sat in my house that my then husband and I had just bought, and went, okay, well, now what am I going to do? What's going on here? And it was just so surreal. And it was also, I was in a smaller job market. I lived in Madison, Wisconsin at the time. And I I was unemployed for 6 months, which felt like just an eternity. I know too, if you're laid off kind of in the fall, if you don't land before Thanksgiving, you're probably going to be laid off till about February or March, and that was the case for me. But it was a whole lot of applying for jobs and waiting, and there wasn't a ton to apply for. And I kind of just did my thing. I actually priced it out like, should I go get a part-time job? And after I did the math, I'm like, well, I'll actually be money behind, and I'll have committed 40 hours a week to not doing things that will get me a new grown-up job. So it was a very odd experience just to go through.
So after the impact, this is what we also like to bring to people because there are emotional, mental effects after losing a job. And you mentioned that you had just bought a house. How did that cause friction in the home? Or if it did, it may not have, but now your husband at the time had to handle probably majority of the bills.
Yeah.
Did cause any confusions?
And
If you
it's we were fortunate that I, I'm sure our finances were not in great shape, and I guess I just kind of put that aside and didn't think about it too much because we could at least pay our bills and stay in our house, which was good. Um, what I remember most was, and I'm somebody, I like to work. I always like my job. I do learning and development for a living, so I always help people to overcome obstacles. And so it's such a strange feeling to be in this position where you're like, okay, I am kind of useless right now. And I remember at that, and that was before I had my daughter. I just remember that it was like I was trying to figure out what to do with myself. And you can only clean so much. I think part of my schedule was like I was watching a lot of Law and Order because at that time that was on TV 4 times a day, and I think some days I watched that all the time. I felt just very disconnected. I felt like I didn't have anything to talk to people about because that was a big thing that was important to me. Um, and I think it's the thing I think is the hardest about being laid off, aside from the initial like worry about like, oh my God, am I going to be able to pay my bills? Am I going to ever find a job again? Because in your head, you're just like, I don't know, maybe this is it. Maybe I'm just never going to work again. And all the fallout from that. But a lot of it is that you don't know how long it's going to last. You know, you're not really unemployed for like months and months at a time. You're unemployed a week at a time because every week you're like, well, maybe I'll get a call, maybe somebody will talk to me, maybe I'll start to move down that path, and maybe I'll be employed in a couple of weeks. But you don't know. And sometimes it's 9 months of a week at a time, and sometimes it's a month and a half, and you just have no idea. And it's hard to plan anything. First of all, I didn't want to spend any money on anything because, you don't know how long this is going to last. In that case, I hadn't been there very long. I didn't have like severance or anything like that. It's like, well, you just stop getting paid and okay, I guess we're just doing this now. So it's just that feeling of like not knowing when your life gets to begin. And then just that bit of like, and then you have some shame, like, okay, why did this happen to me? What did I do? And I'm somebody who overthinks and takes a lot of responsibility for everything too. So it's just hard to manage all those feelings. Just trying to figure out like, now what do I do? And you feel hopeless as you're applying for jobs, especially if you're in a time when there are a lot of layoffs and there's just not a lot happening. It's just that unsettling feeling of kind of worthlessness too. And I can't hear you.
you're on mute.
There we
You're
go.
on, no, Sid's on mute. Uh-oh. You might have to log out and come back in. She might have to log out. Hold on. I can't even unmute.
Hmm.
I just paused it.
Well, all good. Cool.
Yeah. It's on the chat. It happens sometimes. You have to shut like your whole computer down and come back in again.
Okay, so um, we know that layoffs kind of are to alleviate some companies financially and things like that. But would you say that it also kind of help makes an obedient workforce, and where once you are rehired, you kind of overcompensate, thinking you can kind of dodge that process if it ever comes again? Did you find yourself doing that, once you were rehired after layoffs, kind of, maybe doing more than you should have, stated on paper?
I definitely think once you go through a layoff, I'm first of all, I'm super aware of what the conditions often are that lead up to a layoff. So and this is something that I wrote about in my book and that I blog about too, but it's like if there's something going on just in the world, and I think of like a COVID-19 or any sort of an economic issue, I think of, has your company been taken over? Has it been, do you have new ownership? Are you merging? Are you splitting apart? Do you have a new leader at the top? Do you just have a new manager at your level? I'm very mindful of all of those things, and I'm kind of on alert when things happen, just like this could either be a really good opportunity or this might be the beginning of the end, and you never quite know. Uh, I also feel like sometimes when I've been laid off, it's because, I'm hired for a specific thing. Lots of times I'm hired to create something from the ground up or to fix something that's kind of a mess. And I feel like at first when I'm hired, people are really excited to hear what I have to say. And they're like, oh, we're going to build this thing. This is going to be awesome. But I also feel like after a while, they just don't want to hear any more out of me. And they're like, we just need this to be done, and we need to stop having this need improvements. And I'm like, well, it still does. I would say after being laid off, there are times when I would on purpose be like, you know what, I'm going to keep my mouth shut a little bit on this because I want to keep on earning that living and getting my paycheck. And that's hard because I'm not somebody who wants to not say what I think and not be helpful and not make things better. But I feel like I choose those opportunities a little bit more, which isn't always bad. But sometimes I feel like I should speak up more than I do. But I think, you have a job end suddenly a few times and you start to go, well, maybe I need to choose my words a little bit more carefully, or maybe I need to keep quiet sometimes. So I think that's definitely a factor. And it's hard because that's not how I want to live, but I also really like paying my bills and living indoors and not feeling that anxiety of like, okay, well, now what am I going to do? And feeling like I have to start over again.
Mhm. So you think sometimes not saying nothing keeps your job a little bit longer opposed to expressing how you feel?
Unfortunately, I do sometimes. I feel like one of the things that organizations talk about sometimes is psychological safety. And, ideally, that's a case where you feel comfortable at work bringing things up and having concerns. And I think that sometimes when organizations are undergoing changes that make it seem like maybe something negative might happen to the future of your job, you start going, I don't feel quite as psychologically safe as I would like to. And I think maybe I'm going to be a little bit more quiet. So I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of some of those kinds of changes is that, if you're going to do a really good job, like in whatever you do, you need to be willing to take some risks and you need to be able to say, hey, I don't agree with that. And I wouldn't say I would go so far as to let like abuse slide or like stealing money or something bad like that. But there are times when it's like, I know we could do this better, but I don't think I'm not going to bring this particular thing up. I'm going to let that go. And I'm going to try to stay under the radar on some things, which is just an unfortunate part of that.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure that, not professionally and even personally, with it having happened so many times, um, you've, went over the kind of the A, B's and C's, everything. You've tried
Yep.
to figure this thing out. How would you say the selection process is done? Or what have you found as to how companies are picking, people for layoffs?
I would say it probably depends on the organization. I mean, I think some companies are probably very planful and they're looking at numbers and they're looking at the future and they're trying to figure out how do they make the numbers work? How do they make sure that whatever they have for a budget is matching more closely to the people that they have? Um, but I also know that there are companies that aren't quite as planful, and I think it's hard sometimes to know how they're making their decisions. So, I mean, there's no magic formula for not being somebody that gets laid off. Um, and unfortunately, you don't always know what goes into that. Again, talking to different, people who I've worked with who are in HR, it's like sometimes it's very planful, and sometimes it's like, well, we got too many people kind of here. I guess we'll cut some of them. I know working in one environment where reporting to a larger entity, I know a number of people kind of at my level of management positions were let go. And it's like, well, did they pick me on purpose for whatever reason. I don't know. I just know that myself and a number of people in that same sort of position were let go. I remember once being on the other side of a layoff, the same company that later my paycheck bounced at, where they said, "Hey, we're going to do a layoff. Pick which one of your two people who report to you you want to lay off." And I basically, fortunately, I talked them into saying, "Dude, here's what this guy does. Here's what this guy does. We're going to be hurting if we get rid of one of these people." And they went, "Oh, okay." And so I actually managed to save the jobs of both of those people. So, and I don't know what their criteria was for making a decision. It might have just been like, "Hey, Tim, pick your people and decide who's not going to be here anymore." Or I'm guessing it was a little bit more squishy if I could talk him out of doing that. So, and that was a very small company. And again, that was the company where my paycheck bounced to. So I think there were a lot of issues going on there. But yeah, you don't always know.
And I want to jump back because I do want to discuss this because I've been through this a lot. So I want to hear your perspective from this. I know on one of the jobs you said you did go through work abuse. Can you talk a little bit about the work abuse, and did the work abuse
Mm-hmm.
lead? And did you get laid off at that job?
I did eventually. And
Okay,
it kind of made me wonder if there was a cause and effect relationship between that.
that's what I was going to ask you. That's
I
what
mean,
I was
it's
going to
like,
ask. Mhm.
I think it's one of those cases that after you go through a situation that is less than ideal, you step back from it and you go, "Oh, here's what I should have done." Well, now I know a lot more than I did then. One of the groups that I've done a lot of volunteering for is a group out of Minneapolis that's called the White Box Club. And it's a man named Michael Thomas Sonnerberg who was laid off from Target and basically said, "I don't want to go through this alone. I'm going to start this group to talk about all these things." And I was a volunteer facilitator there for year and a half. And one of the questions that kept coming up was questions about age discrimination and just discrimination in general and what you can do. And so I actually reached out to a lawyer and talked to him a bit. And now I know how I would have gone about filing a complaint and where I might have gone and what I might have done beyond just my company. And that was a case too, where again, it was a smaller sort of scrappier startup where it's amazing. Well, it's not amazing. I wish it was. It's hard sometimes to find what the right channel is because, I did what you're supposed to do when you have an issue. In that case, which again was a while back, I, talked to HR, and at that point, that particular person said, "Well, what did you do to provoke that person?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is going nowhere fast." And again, later, um, I learned a whole bunch of stuff about what I should have done. And I think too that when you're in the middle of something like that, it's you kind of go, "What can I personally handle right now?" And I had a smaller child at that point, and I'm like, I just want to like go to my job, and I don't want to be like, you know, labeled as somebody who's difficult and who is going to be hard to work with and have kind of that blemish. And I'm like, so I did have one case where after the fact, I'm like, should have done more. But by the same token, I also am like, I don't think I had it in me right then. I mean, I would love to say that I've always got the fight to go do that stuff. And, I've at different times I've picked that battle and I've done what I wish past me would have had it in me to do. But boy, it's, and I know you and I talked just briefly about your experiences with this. It's like, it is not easy. You deal with so much just grief. And even if you're right, and even if it works out in your favor, boy, is that just a lot of ugly that goes into that to try and get to an okay place. So anyway, to answer your original question, yeah, I mean, I dealt with that. That's one of those things that I kick myself about sometimes, but another thing that I also believe is whenever I have been laid off or I've had a job that's ended, I have always ended up somewhere better. And it's amazing just how whenever you go, I found that whenever in general I've gone through trauma in life, because nobody ever likes trauma. Trauma always sucks when you're going through it. It is awful. And I think that hopefully you figure out how to make it through. you have your support system around you, you figure out how to kind of keep it together, and you keep doing the right things and you move forward. And like I said, I feel really fortunate that I have always ended up someplace that was a better fit than I was before. But boy, you gotta work for that. And that is not easy. And that's
So,
exhausting.
hold on really quick. So you do feel as though a lot of folks that are going through work abuse, even if it's by leadership, they end up getting rolled out of the company through layoffs.
I think it's definitely a possibility. Um,
Hmm.
in my personal experience, when I've been through layoffs, if I think about the reasons, a lot of times, um, I feel like the answer that's kind of the non-answer answer is that it is reorganization of some sort. One of the workarounds that sometimes places do is they'll eliminate your position. Oh, no, no, it's not you. We've eliminated your position. And I'm like, well, so I guess that's me too that gets eliminated. Um, so I can definitely see that being kind of a workaround for addressing an issue. Um, I am I am sure it happens. I've also had cases where I've been a part of a larger company that was doing the ongoing reductions in force where it's like somebody would just like not be there the next day. And in that case, um, I know when I went through my layoff, I actually got a report that said, here's the names and ages and here's everybody who got laid off. And I'm sure that was a deterrent to say, don't think it's because you're this old and because of this. It's like here's the list, so you can look at that and go, well, I see a couple people older than me and a couple people younger than me are still working there or left, so making it a little bit more interesting for legal action. But I again, I given that we don't necessarily know how companies always decide to do layoffs, I'm sure that people are laid off for lots of reasons, and some of them are legit and some of them are like, well, that solves two problems. So I mean, it's unfortunate, but yeah.
So I know it'll probably vary from state to state and each company. But I guess in general, what are companies required to tell you at that time, or um, what do they what I guess do they have to disclose, in regard to compliance about the within the workforce force or laws?
I'm guessing you're right that it varies state by state. I know that in one case, it was a company that was, I currently live in Nebraska previously, and I've been laid off in Wisconsin and in Minnesota, and then the last company was in Texas. So I've seen different requirements. I also think that a company that's larger and more established will probably do more to try and head off any sort of legal action at the pass. In general, when I've had those layoff meetings, they're trying to tell you about as little as they can have to tell you. In general, those meetings are short. They're like, hey, this is your last day, or you're not going to work here anymore, or your job's gone away, or we're having a reduction in force and you're part of it. They keep it pretty to the point. Usually it's like, we'll send you a packet that talks about your benefit options. If there's any sort of a severance, so you get any sort of money after the fact or any other benefits, they will usually say, hey, here's what you have to read and sign in order to get that. Depending on the state, for example, Nebraska is a state where if you leave a company, the company has to pay out your vacation time. Not all states are like that. But basically, they'll tell you kind of as minimal a group of things as they can, really to just say, hey, it's your last day. Here's some information about when your benefits end. And then if you are getting severance, here's an agreement that you need to sign, usually prior to getting money. So again, they're trying to keep it short. They're typically it's kind of the as little as they can say, but just you're not working here anymore. And that's kind of the end of it. I would also say that when you're going through that, I'm like, you know, I kind of know now that like if you see the last minute, like, oh, I've got a 15-minute meeting with somebody, that's That's lots of times what that is. And it's like when your boss pops up on the screen and then someone else who it's like, oh, I bet that's the HR person because you have a witness in the room. And you kind of hear your bit and then you're done 5 minutes later. And then they email you stuff because you're like, I'm not going to remember a bunch of it. It is funny though. One of my recent layoffs, I had a very good boss who I really liked. And I think she learned that day that she was going to do layoffs. So hard to be her too, who's like, ugh. And I felt like during that, I was like, it's okay. I'll be fine because she was such a wreck. But yeah, short and sweet and figuring out a bunch of stuff later on.
Have you had to do layoffs personally? I know you saved two people, but have you personally had to do layoffs? Can
I not. I had one case where, like I said, they said, which one of your employees do you want to get rid of? And I managed to keep them both. I have
Okay.
been employed at places where I've been left, and I've been like where I've still been working after other people have been laid off, and then I've been one of the laid off people. I have done some position elimination. Well, like I've had some cases where there have been people who've been let go for cause, and that sucks too. So I mean, it's just a gut-wrenching experience regardless, just because it's, hey, remember how you thought your life was going to be? Yeah, it's not going to be like that anymore. But yeah.
hmm So, even in a situation, and I guess we don't speak about the impact of the person that has to lay the person off and how that may emotionally affect them. And I know you were in a situation to potentially have to let people off, so you more than likely had that piece of emotion, but not as in depth. At that moment when they asked you to lay um, two of
Yep.
your folks off, how did that make you feel as a boss, knowing that you had to lay someone off in that
Oh,
situation?
just terrible. I mean, if, I can honestly see, even if it was somebody that I didn't even particularly click with or like, oh, what an awful thing to do. I mean, just that somebody, I think of just what I think the rest of my week looks like. And, I've got plans to do this and I'm going to get together with friends. I'm going to do whatever. And then to have kind of the rug pulled out from under you, that's like, oh no, here's the stuff you're going to be doing. You're going to try and figure out how you're going to pay your health insurance for the next little bit. You're going to try and figure out what to do with yourself. You're going to see, okay, do all my kids do they all get to play soccer? Or do we not have enough money to do that now? I mean, it's just awful because again, you're messing with people's lives, and I think that's the hardest part. And especially if it's something they haven't gone through before, or knowing people's families, it's like, well, is that the one person in that family who typically carries their benefits? Do you have a stay-at-home parent there? And then you're like, yep, here's how your life is going to change, and unfortunately, I have to be the bearer of bad news. I know I whenever I come across people who have been laid off, I have an article that I always sent them that I wrote that's like, here's what you should do. Like, step one, take care of yourself, work through your grief, work through your emotions. People automatically want to run out and try to find another job, and you're in no mindset to like know what you want or do that well. You got to manage your emotions and you got to deal with that right away financial stuff. But yeah, it's ugly all the way around.
Now, which layoff for you was the most significant or detrimental, to your livelihood once it happened?
So I would say that I'll talk about the one that was the most traumatic. So my first layoff, 9/11, cool. My second layoff, I worked for a company that had attempted to acquire a company that hadn't worked, and then they had been acquired by a different company. And we just had a week of like, yay, everybody, we're going to run this company and it's going to be awesome sort of meetings. And then I and it was actually Groundhog's Day. I came into work, I sat down at my desk. I had one coworker, said hi to him, and I started crunching numbers because at that time, my then husband and I had decided, yep, this isn't working. We're going to get divorced. And the night before, he and I and our young daughter had gone and looked at condos. We just didn't tell them that we were looking for two. So I was sitting at my desk, taking the first few minutes of my morning, just crunching numbers, going, hey, can I afford this place to live on my own? And how is that going to work? And so I got the tap on the shoulder. I went into a conference room. And again, I don't remember a whole ton of it, but was told my job was over, got a box, went back to my desk, packed up, looked at my coworker and said, I'm gone, packed my stuff up. And I found myself like out sitting in my car. And I remember I called my then husband and I just said, hey, I got laid off. And he went, huh. And that was our whole conversation because we were just like, what is this? So just one of those cases where you kind of have everything falling apart and it just keeps going. I also remember that weekend I had plans to go see friends. So I was driving in Wisconsin. I was in a small town and I got pulled over for speeding. And as I got pulled over, I looked in the passenger seat of my car and I had my letter from unemployment that basically said that my unemployment was going to be a couple $100 less than it had been the previous time I was unemployed because there were some incentives after 9/11. And I realized, okay, well, with what I'm making, I can't pay my half of the house payment. And so as the policeman came up to talk to me, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to just, if he tries to give me a ticket, I'm going to cry. And there's no faking about this. This is all that's left. And got off with the warning, drove, and I was like, oh, this is just awful. So basically for the next few months, what I did is I looked for jobs. I kind of stayed away from my house as much as I could, hung out with friends, kind of took turns watching my daughter, and decided to move to Minneapolis because I'm like, I need to be in a bigger job market. But that was just an awful 4 months of like, oh my goodness, everything is falling apart. And it's funny, as I was getting ready we were already planning on kind of separately or in tandem moving to Minneapolis from Madison. But I just kept thinking, this is awesome because at least I'll keep my job. So I'll have some form of consistency as I'm moving. And then I didn't have that. It's just like, so, given how much of just our worth is tied up in our job, much less your ability to pay your bills and, your identity, that was just messy. And fortunately, I found something in about May of the next year. So it was one of my shorter unemployments. It was about 4 months. And I remember after I started my new job, which fortunately I was at for 8 years. So that was good once I got going. I didn't do anything for a couple months. I would literally come home from work and I'm like, I'm done. I would lay on my floor. There was a weird little mark in my ceiling and I would lay on the floor and I would look at the squiggly part in my ceiling. And that was what I would do some nights just because I was like, I have to heal from all the stuff that's just happened. And what a mess. And I'm like, I'm not going to go do anything cool. I'm not going to be, adventurous. It's like, nope, I'm not going to go to that restaurant because I don't have it in me to do anything new. I couldn't even watch a new movie for a long time because I'm like, nope, I can't absorb new information. I'm just trying to heal. And I didn't sleep. So that was like catch up on sleep. But just what an awful, just everything kind of ganged up you at once. And, when you think about like, what's the good part of that? Good Lord, I can make it through anything. And, it's not fun, but, then you look at other challenges in life and you go, okay, this is going to suck, but you know what? I can do this. I did that. I can totally do this. I don't have to all the time, but I know that I'm way tougher than I thought I was.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you mentioned that because I was going to say losing a job. So now we're back at this because I asked you the first time you lost your job, you were able to afford the things in your house, but the second go around, you lose your job and you're unable to financially come up with your other part of the mortgage. And I know there's probably other financial aspects to it. And you're separating, potentially going through a divorce, and then
Yep.
you have to find another place. What were your emotions at the time? Like mentally, what did you go through at that time? And what was your ex-husband's reaction? Did he step up or did he add more fuel to the fire? Like, just so folks that are going through that can see mentally like the challenges.
I'm fortunate in that, it was interesting. We basically just came to the conclusion, like, this isn't working. But I know one of the things that was very important to me, I didn't want to have that kind of a relationship where all my daughter ever heard was me complaining about her dad, because that's not doing anybody any favors. And again, always paid his bills, stand-up guy, good to her, helpful, did all the things you'd want somebody to do, just wasn't working being married. And, I remember living in Wisconsin at that time. When you get divorced, you have to go like sit in court. And it's funny because I met him at his workplace. We like went and had lunch. And then we went, and when we sat in divorce court, we just sat at the same table. And I don't think he realized that there was going to be like almost a trial. So they did their thing, and he's like, "What is this?" And the judge asked so, just talking about supporting one another and that kind of stuff. And a very odd picture I have in my head, but he's like, "Oh no, I will continue to support, make sure that we have a roof over our heads and stuff like that. And until we get through this and get the house sold, and we'll split it." So, I mean, I got it to, I have to hand it to him. It's like we knew we weren't going to be together, but it was healthy enough that he was helpful in that respect. And then we kind of moved and had a pretty good co-parenting relationship. But I also feel pretty fortunate that was true too. Cause I mean, talk about going through a whole bunch of traumas all at the same time. And I remember taking an assessment shortly after I started my job, after I'd been laid off that second time, when I was going through all this. And I had looked up a chart of what are the most stressful things that you can go through in life. And I was like, oh, this is why I'm tired. And I realized that nobody in my family had died. That was the thing that hadn't happened. And I hadn't myself or somebody close to me had not gone to prison, but otherwise all the things on that list had happened between moving cross country, losing a job, getting a divorce. It's oh, but I mean, so again, fortunately we got through it. That sometimes we're uglier than others, but fortunately made it through. Didn't have any super big trauma, walked away with some debt. But, of all the things I could have walked away with, that was probably my best case scenario. And I think of times when I was moving, and it's and going through that, it's it's you're trying to separate your finances. It's okay, so we bounced some checks because we're not communicating well. And that's and again, running up some debt and being okay, so how much cash can I get so that I can pay for these few things I need to do when I'm moving? And whose couch am I going to crash on so I could make this move as cheaply as possible? So it's a lot to go through, and it's a lot to manage. And again, it wasn't pleasant. It could have been significantly worse, but all I can say is, boy, are you grateful when things are just kind of normal again. Just being in a place where I'm living someplace, and I've got a roof over my head, and I'm employed at something I like, and the people I'm around are cool, and I'm just going to heal and just kind of get back to okay, and now I'm sleeping. All right. And then over time, it's all right, I'm getting my money more under control. Good. And just the nice thing about it is if you're running a little depressed, you don't go out and spend a whole bunch of money because you're I'm not going anyplace. I'm sitting right here. This is what I'm doing. So and eventually you kind of start moving again, and things kind of feel better. But that is definitely the worst, kind of the down part of that, just trying to figure out and you just kind of keep moving forward because you're well, that's all there is to do, is to just, look for a job, find a place to live, work things out as we go, and just kind of work it through.
I'm sorry. Right now, what outside of your personal experience, of course, what makes you the layoff lady? How did you come up with that? And, how are you assisting those, that are dealing with layoffs or that have dealt with layoffs?
Cool. So the layoff lady kind of came up kind of accidentally. I think someone had just used the words layoff and lady in the same sentence. And I'm I kind of like that. So I grabbed that. My current husband's also an artist, so he drew my logo, which was kind of cool. But I just liked how that was a quick hit and sort of encapsulated who I was and what I wanted to do, which is helping people who'd been through layoffs. Some of the ways that I've helped folks, first of all, if anybody has a friend of a friend who's been laid off, I'm great, I'll talk to him. I'll help get him set right, listen to him a little bit, give him a few pieces of advice depending on where they're at. And probably my biggest piece of advice is take a breath, take a breath, slow down. Don't feel like you have to run and jump into the next thing. Even if it's just a couple of days, just chill, work through that initial pain that you have, and then try to get your head about you and figure out how to move forward. So again, I've had lots of one-on-one conversations with people. Like I'd mentioned, I'd volunteered for this group called the White Box Club, where I just started putting together presentations based on what kinds of questions people were asking me. And that led to me doing a blog where I basically addressed the questions that people had, or the questions that like I had that I figured out. So a lot of what I've thought to tell people is based on the experiences of other people who have come to me and asked, or somebody who said, hey, do you have anything that you've written on this particular thing? And I'm like, well, no, but I'm going to write it now. And then I'll share that with them. So it was a lot of what I did with doing my blog and writing a book was just getting all of what I had done in a nice package that I could hand to somebody and say, listen, things are going to be messy for a bit. Here's what I needed when this first happened to me, just to get through it and to figure out, first of all, you're not crazy. And yeah, a lot of this is awful and it's all going to be okay. You just don't know how long it's going to take for it to get okay again. So that's kind of what brought me to do that, just as a way to help people and just to get all my thoughts in order. And it's funny, I'd been threatening to write a book for like 3 layoffs or so. And this time, just the time and place to do it, and managed to get all my thoughts together, and worked with a number of friends who read through it and gave me feedback, and talked to everybody I could who'd been through it to get their experiences, and managed to get that put together.
Okay. So I was going to ask, with the Miss Layoff lady, do you experience, like, it becomes like, for us with the work we do, like personal. So when you're feeling that someone else has lost their job, the emotional piece of them coming to you with the grief, and I know there can be different levels to that. How do you deal with folks coming to you with grief of being let go of a job, and how does that impact you? Just to know, I know you're helping, but it's not a lot of help, because it's like we can't financially give you the money to help you through the things that you're going through. So how does that emotionally impact you?
It always hits. I think anytime you talk to somebody who's going through something that you've been through and you remember how awful it was to go through it, I always feel for people. And I feel like one of the things that I can do is just listen, because I think that just in general, I think that most people want to help. They want to do something helpful, but lots of times you get unsolicited advice. You get advice that's terrible. You get advice that it's like, ugh, you've not been in this situation. Maybe that makes sense for you to do. Maybe that made sense for your friend to take that action, but that's not what's right for me. And so I think it's giving them some language to use when people are telling them, hey, you should go just start your own business. And it's like, well, you don't just up and do that quick and then it's like running and it's making money. It's like that's kind of an endeavor. And maybe you don't want to do that. Or you should just take the first job you should get, or you should move or sell your house or do whatever thing you should do. So a lot of what I do again is listen, acknowledge, let them know that it does suck. It's an awful thing to go through, and that, you don't have to do what people suggest you do. And in fact, here's some talking points, so that if somebody says, something that I think they think helps, which is, you could just get a job at the factory. And it's like, yeah, I could, but that's probably not helpful advice right now. But so I think it's mostly just listening and empathizing, and giving them a little insight on, here's the things you don't want to do right away. And then getting in touch with them a little later too, because I think everybody is out, like, if they hear you get laid off, they're like, oh my God, let me help. And then they all go away because everybody gets busy with their lives and they kind of forget that happened and that you're still out there. So I think just, again, trying to support people later on too. But it's always hard, but I hope it at least makes some difference. And if nothing else, makes people feel less alone.
Absolutely. Now, have you found that there are any sure shot ways to kind of solidify your position at a job, or, you know, is it just kind of more so you have to play on the defensive and just kind of wait and see?
I think it's kind of both. And I mean, so a ton of it, I think, is mindset. So for me, it's like some of the big things that I remind people to do. One of them is that, people talk about being the CEO of your career. You need to be the CEO of your life. So when you make decisions, you need to make them like I'm running myself, which is my company, and I need to make good decisions for me. And I think that if when you work for a company, you have some loyalty to them, and I think that's great. But we also need to be mindful of when is that not doing you a lot of favors. So I think it's a matter of trying to do a good job at the work that you're at, but also making sure that you're building connections and that you're meeting different people and that you're keeping your skills up to date and that you are continuing to learn and grow so that if something does happen, you have options and you can start to look for something else. So again, I think it's kind of both and yeah, it's and some places will say make yourself indispensable. And sure, that's great too. But I think when push comes to shove, if there's a case where there's a company and there are financial issues and they need to make some eliminations, that's just business. So part of it is keeping your mind in the same place that you say, you know what, I like these people, I like this place, but right now this isn't working for me. I need to make a change because that's more what's right for me. So yeah, shift in mindset, shift in kind of attitude towards it, that career resilience mindset.
Good advice. I wanted to ask, for those you have been through 7 layoffs, how are you still standing now after those 7 layoffs? And did that mentally impact you at the end of it to say, you know what, I had enough? Are you working now, or it
I
just
am.
solely with the layoff lady?
I
Okay.
am. Nope, working too.
Okay.
Also doing so one of the things that I've always done to process and to cope, and just because I like it, is I've always been a writer. So channeling some of that into writing that could both help me process what I'm feeling and help me work through it, and then also give other people a resource. That's been one way that I've worked through it. How am I still standing? I don't know. Just sheer orneriness and determination. I think I just keep going because I do. Um, I think that it's been hard every single time I've been laid off, and it's a little different each time. My layoffs have lasted anywhere from like a month to 9 months, and that 9 months was like 4,000 years. That was a long time. Um, and it's a financial hit each time because even if I eventually get a job that pays about what I made before or a little bit better, I've probably had and I know I added it up at one point, but I've probably had 3 or 4 years where I didn't have it like worth of income in my life that I didn't have. Well, that's going to impact me when it comes to retirement, when it comes to just buying things. So there's always an impact there. Um, but again, I think a lot of it is just trying to come out of it stronger. For one thing, trying to build some additional income streams just so that I'm not solely dependent on that, trying to build up some savings so that I have a little bit of cushion if something like that happens again. Continuing to build my professional network just so that I know more people who hire people with my skill set so that I have a better chance of being able to land a different job if I want one at some point or if I need one at some point. And just continuing to learning and grow and build my skill set. So, I mean, I know that it could always happen again. I'm, hope for the best, plan for the worst. So I'm always in that mindset, and also just knowing that I can get through it. But I'm also being more planful about what do I want my future work life to look like, because I know that I need to drive that because I can't rely on an employer to be like, oh, here is your 30-year career here at big giant company where you're going to work. It's like you just don't know. And that uncertainty is hard to deal with. But I guess once you accept that, then it's like, well, now what do I do? So I guess it helps a little bit not to be surprised when it happens, not much because it still stinks. But I think it's just figuring out what am I going to do to move forward so that if life happens to me in different ways, like how do I react and what do I do next? So that's been my answer.
Okay. Okay. So we are almost at time. The hour goes fast. I have one more thing, and then Sid is gonna ask you the final question, and then we're gonna close it off. What advice can you give folks that are going through work layoffs, especially someone that's going through a challenging layoff? Because I was laid off. I was out of a full-time job for a year and a half, and it was the most challenging, almost losing everything. And I stand up for work abuse, but I still can't really grasp to tell a person. I can only tell them emotionally how I felt and what I went through and how to do things stronger. But you probably can give a more collective suggestion to folks that are going through layoffs.
And I think, the biggest overall suggestion is be kind to yourself. I think that whenever, just broadly, if we have a problem, I'm always somebody who wants to go attack it and solve it. And it's not a problem that you can like just work it and it'll just be done. It takes as long as it takes. One of the hardest parts about looking for something new is first of all, figuring out what you want and knowing that it's the time in your life you'll probably get the most rejection too. I know when I have some blog articles on my website where I did like my stats for my job search. And I mean, to get one job, it's like you apply for 45 jobs, you apply for, I think my most recent one was well over 100. And you don't know what's going to pop. And there's something that looks great on paper that nothing becomes of. There's something that you applied for on a lark and suddenly it's like, oh, well, that's the job I have. You just don't know. So a lot of it is committing to doing those right things and knowing that if you keep on doing those right things over time, something will pop. And I think the other thing is making sure that you find your people. We all need support. It's a time when you might feel shame, you might feel sad, you might feel like, oh, I'm not good enough, I don't deserve anybody's help, but that's exactly when you need help. So I think figuring out how people can help you and letting them help you, and being ready to pay that back in the future. So I think it's being kind to yourself, it's continuing to move forward, it's finding your people for support, and just knowing that you'll make it through. It might be a bit to do that.
Absolutely. So we have come to shameless plug. So you do see all of your information scrolling across the bottom here. Please let our viewers know how they can contact you, utilize your services. If there's any subjects you want to draw traffic to, merch you have for sale, anything that you want to shine a light on, you do have the floor.
Cool. Yeah. So basically, if you want to check out what I'm up to, I'm on all the socials as the Layoff Lady. You can also check out my website, which is thelayofflady.com. One of the things I always like to point out to people is I have an article that basically is called "I Just Got Laid Off. What Do I Do?" That is the article that I encourage you to share far and wide with anybody who you encounter who has been laid off. That's basically my article I give people so they don't do anything career limiting in that time when you're stressed and you're not sure what to do with yourself and you're going to make hasty decisions, to just slow it down and be like, you know what, deal with your feelings, deal with your money, chill a little bit, and figure out your way forward. I also have my book on there, which again is 7 Lessons from 7 Layoffs, a guide. I have that both in ebook if somebody wants it right this moment to go through, and I have it in paperback. So if you're a person who likes to tactically have a book, but those are both, that's the resource again that I wish I'd had when I'd gone through this. One of the things I also talk about there, it's a lot about the realities of job searching, some things to be cautious about, how to use tools like LinkedIn, and then also how to roll with the punches, because part of it is there's a lot of stuff that you're going to hope for and it's not going to work out. It can be a very exhausting time as you wait to see which one of these things will pop. It can also be a very exciting time because you have this awesome future that you're just like, when is this going to get here so I can see what it is? But I would direct you to those two things. And I'm also working on a next book, which is talking more about opportunity readiness and career resilience. So that's really about, when you are employed, and you have a little bit of mental bandwidth to start to think about what you want to be next and what you want to be when you grow up. How do you do that? And then how do you start to live into that? So those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And share those with anybody who needs them, because it's a rough time. And this is here to hopefully help you get through that time, and to know that you're not alone, and that even though it might feel hopeless, it's actually going to be okay.
Thank you so much, Brenda.
You as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we truly appreciate you, letting the audience, because a lot of folks are going through job loss, and, it's a tough situation, especially when you're the sole provider and you lose your job.
Yeah.
There's just so many different levels, and it's a blessing that you did have support through the first few of the
Yep.
challenges. Your ex-husband was there to step in and help fill a void, but you still went through obstacles through
Yep.
those challenges. So hopefully it has been just different changes, because the strategies now of going through the work loss, and you're working and you're bringing the
Yep.
resources to folks. So this is a beautiful, beautiful thing that you're doing. So for all my listeners that are going through work loss, please reach out to Brenda so that she can give you some additional information to help you through your steps. As you've seen, she's accessible through email and social media platforms. And if you need contact information to reach out to, you can reach out to me or Sid, and we will forward that information to you as well if you did not see it or you need the resource. We want to thank you for tuning in to Unfiltered Unspoken Podcast, where we're going to continue to share life experiences. Ain't that right, City Sid?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So we will see you soon, and we're going to keep coming. So we're not going anywhere. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank all of you.